Good evening and welcome to our weekly Parsha class, Nitzutzai Sparks, or Parsha Tidbits. This week is the Parsha Vayigash. Vayigash literally means, and he approached, referring to Yehuda, who was approaching Yosef, the viceroy of Egypt, because Yosef had charged Benjamin with theft of his goblet, of his silver goblet, and told his brothers that he is going to keep him as a slave. Of all the brothers, one brother comes forward and approaches Joseph and pleads and threatens and says whatever he can possibly say to get Joseph to relent and let Benjamin go. How could he come home to his father without Benjamin? The question has been asked why Yehuda was the only brother to really take the case of Benjamin. What about the other brothers? Yehuda wasn't even the oldest. Reuven was older, Shimon was older, Levi was older. And the answer, simple answer is, as mentioned in Rashi's commentary, that Yehuda promised his father that he would guarantee Benjamin's safety and his safe return. So he had no choice. He took responsibility. Now there's an interesting observation. When Jacob, if you remember in last week's Torah portion, was told by his sons that they cannot return to Joseph without bringing Benjamin, and Jacob said, no, I'm afraid something could happen to him, two of the sons took the initiative to guarantee that he will bring Benjamin back. Reuven, the oldest, makes sense that the oldest would take responsibility, said to his father, if I don't bring him back, you can kill two of my sons, which Rashi says Jacob obviously couldn't accept. He says, what, they're not my sons? They're not my children? Jacob totally rejected Reuven's offer of bringing him back. But when Yehuda said, I will guarantee it, he relented. Why? So one of the interesting commentaries says that Reuven had 4 sons. When he tried to use his son's life as a guarantee that he will bring back Benjamin, why did he offer 2 sons? Why not all 4? Because Reuven in his mind was not totally convinced and confident that he had the ability to bring Benjamin back. And therefore he was not willing to sacrifice everything. But putting that aside, Reuven was not prepared to sacrifice his entire existence. Yehuda said, I will forfeit this world and the next world, as Rashi points out. That he not only said, I will guarantee Benjamin, and if not, something bad could happen to me, he said, I lose everything, I forfeit everything. When Jacob heard that, he said, this man really takes it seriously. This man's guarantee is ironclad because he's willing to sacrifice everything. Yehuda is the ancestor of King David and the ancestor of Mashiach. Why did Yehuda merit to be the progenitor of the leaders, of the monarchs, of the greatest Jewish leaders of all times, up until and through Mashiach? Because that is the hallmark of a true leader who leaves nothing behind, is prepared to make the ultimate guarantee that he will bring Benjamin, symbolizing the Jewish people, back to their source, back to their Father in heaven. He will do everything, sacrifice life and limb to restore the physical and spiritual well-being of every single member of his people. That explains Yehuda's incredible leadership capabilities. Now, Vayigash Elov Yehuda, and Yehuda approaches him. Who does Yehuda approach? Joseph. Now, Yehuda and Yosef were two brothers, but they are also symbols of two kingdoms. The Jewish people were divided into two separate kingdoms. People talk now about a two-state solution. There was a two-state solution in the past. Both were Jewish states, and it didn't work out. The two states were the state of Yehuda, Judea, and the state of Israel, which contained 10 of the 12 tribes that seceded from the union of the 12 tribes after King Solomon's death, and they were taken over by Jeroboam, who was a descendant of Ephraim, of Joseph, and Rechavam, Solomon's son, was the king of Yehuda, and he himself was a descendant, of course, of the original Yehuda. So there were two kingdoms. One kingdom is represented by Joseph, and one by Yehuda. Now, which is the dominant of the two kingdoms? Well, here, when we read about the progenitors, Joseph and Yehuda, who is approaching whom? Yehuda is approaching Joseph and pleading with him. However, in the future, especially in the future Messianic age, which the Haftorah, the prophetic reading, refers to, the two kingdoms will coalesce into one kingdom, and the kingdom of Joseph will become part of and subsumed within the kingdom of Yehuda. He will be the dominant one. And God tells the prophet Ezekiel, take two pieces of wood, write Joseph on one and write Yehuda on the other, put them together, and my servant David, descendant of Yehuda, will be the exclusive leader and monarch. So the Rebbe asks the question, the Haftorah usually reflects the reading of the Parsha. In the Parsha, Joseph is the dominant one. Yehuda comes to him and pleads with him. Whereas in the Haftorah, Yehuda is the dominant one. The Rebbe explains that even in the Parsha, if we reflect on what happened here, we see how Yehuda is really on top. Yes, he has to depend on Joseph. That's a symbol of Jews who are in exile, who are dependent on the government, because in that time Yehuda thought Joseph was a non-Jewish leader of Egypt. We depend on that government for our security, for our well-being. However, Yehuda does not ask permission. Yehuda does not go through any of the diplomatic channels. He goes straight to Joseph, goes over to him, and with firmness and conviction and determination, virtually demands that Joseph release Benjamin. And that strength and that determination, that courage, demonstrates that even when we're in exile, even when we are part of another government that is our master in a certain sense, because that's what it means to be in exile, that we're not totally free and independent, we do not lose our Jewish pride, our Jewish courage, our steadfast determination to be Jewish no matter what. That's what Vayigash Elov Yehuda demonstrates. Now, after Yehuda makes his impassioned plea to Joseph to let Benjamin go, the Torah says that Joseph couldn't contain himself any longer. And he tells everyone to leave, all the Egyptians to leave. And right after that it says, there was no one there when Joseph revealed his identity to his brothers. First it says that Joseph could not restrain himself in the presence of all who stood before him, so he called out, "Remove everyone from before me." Thus no one remained with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. So the question is asked, isn't that obvious? If Joseph ordered everyone removed, then it's obvious that no one remained. So why does it have to repeat that no one remained? The Shem Shmuel, one of the great Hasidic masters, explains that it means that literally no one was there, not even the angels. Not even the celestial beings were there. And he explains that angels are part of the system that God created in this world. Angels are messengers. They are God's messengers, and they're also our messengers. They help bring our prayers closer to God. They polish our prayers, as it says. They shine them. They make them more perfect. Our prayers are very, very much imperfect. But when the Geula, when the redemption happens, the future redemption with Mashiach, we will no longer need the support of angels. We will be able to do whatever we have to do without the assistance of God's angels. We will have the ability to reconcile with one another. See, today, when there is conflict, whether the conflict is between one Jew and another, which unfortunately is so common, or when it's a conflict between ourselves and God, we usually need someone to be an intermediary, someone to be a mediator, to help bring the two parties together. Because of our egos, because of our personality clashes, we can't reconcile on our own. We need an outside party to do it, and we should avail ourselves of that outside party. Same thing with God. Sometimes we feel incapable of communicating with God, so we need someone to inspire us, someone to help remove whatever impediments that exist. In the Messianic age, when we will be exposed to the spiritual aspect of everything in this world, we will be able to transcend our differences. We will be able to remove the need for all of the outside support systems. Yes, if you need an outside support system, if you need a crutch, use it. But in the Messianic age, we will no longer need that crutch. So it's interesting that when Joseph is looking for his brothers and he can't find them, it says he meets a man, and the man tells him where the brothers were. Who was that man? So Rashi says it was an angel, the angel Gabriel. But yet here, when Joseph reconciles with his brothers, that was when Joseph was going to be sold by his brothers, almost killed by them. An angel comes and makes it happen. Here, the angels are left out of it because that beginning of the story symbolizes exile. Exile conditions necessitate angels to make things happen. Redemption dynamic is different. There we don't need the angels. Joseph tells his brothers two words. Ani Yosef, I am Joseph. Of course he says more than those two words, but we're going to focus on those two words. The Chafetz Chaim, one of the great Lithuanian sages of the 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries. One of his passions, Chafetz Chaim, we all, of course, have heard about how strong he spoke against Lashon Hara, speaking ill of others. But he had another passion, and the two passions are connected. The passion for Mashiach, for the redemption. They say that he had a suitcase always packed, ready to go the moment that Mashiach announces his arrival, and he wouldn't have to go packing because he was so much into the yearning for Mashiach to come. And it's reflected in this interpretation. He said, look, Joseph says two words, and those two words, in Hebrew it's two, in English it would be few more words. I am Joseph, 3 words. But here in Hebrew, 2 words, and what did that do? It answered all the questions of his brothers. Now imagine this, the brothers come to Egypt, innocent, have only one intention, to buy grain. Then all of a sudden, the king, the viceroy, he was more or less like the king, interviews them personally and accuses them of being spies, starts to ask them questions about their family, accuses them of being spies, then he's nice to them, then he accuses them, then he's nice, then he accuses them. They were so baffled, they had so many questions unanswered. With the 2 words that Joseph says, I am Joseph, all the questions fall to the wayside. There's no longer any question. Now we understand. They understood what was going on throughout the entire ordeal. And the Chafetz Chaim said the same thing will happen in the Messianic age. God will say 2 words, Ani Hashem, I am God. That means God will reveal his presence in our lives. And that will remove all the questions that we have, about why there was suffering in the past and why things didn't exactly work out the way they should have worked out, why there was evil in this world. All of that will disappear. There will be no more questions because God will just announce those 2 words, Ani Hashem, I am God. Very beautiful insight. Then Joseph tells them, V'ata al teyatzvu, and now do not be sad. This is in chapter 44. This is verse 5. Obviously, Joseph is telling them that it's only normal that they should feel such remorse and such regret to the point of being depressed that they did this to Joseph. He says, don't be depressed. This is all part of God's plan. There's a beautiful Hasidic commentary from the Sfas Emes. There's a medrash that says that whenever the Torah uses the word ata can be spelled 2 ways, with an aleph that means you, ata with an ayin means now. Whenever the word ata is used in the Torah, that in the sense of now, it's referring to tshuva, it's referring to repentance, return to God. There are many reasons why the word now is indicative of tshuva. One explanation is that tshuva is now in the moment. It's something that doesn't care about what will happen in the future, what happened in the past. God says, in this moment, if you change, you have a change of heart, I accept you. But be that as it may, the word ata means tshuva, repentance. And this is what Joseph is telling his brothers, and this is the message to us. When you do tshuva, when you recognize you made mistakes, and we all make mistakes in life, and we regret it, do not do it with depression, with sadness. Tshuva, number 1, doesn't involve sadness. Yes, it involves regret. You can even be, in a certain sense, embittered and feeling terrible that you did something, but you cannot allow it to lead to depression, because depression itself, while not an official sin, will weaken your resolve and will get you to do more and more sins. In fact, there's a famous Hasidic saying, I think it's attributed to Reb Nachman of Breslov, but I heard it attributed to others as well, that the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, doesn't want us to sin. Doesn't care about the particular sin that it's getting us to do. What it really wants is for us to become depressed because of that sin. And once you're depressed, you are vulnerable, and you will be able to not resist in the future. And the Yetzer Hara, the evil impulse, will have you under his grasp, and you will not be able to release yourself from it. At any rate, when you do tshuva, don't be depressed. And the Sfas Emes adds that initially, when Joseph was giving them a hard time, they expressed regret. They said, Ashem emanachnu, we are guilty. We didn't give in to Joseph's pleas when he was begging us to spare him. So there they were doing tshuva out of a sense of fear. She says, now you have to do it with joy. No more sadness. Now, when Joseph sees his brother Benjamin, later on in verse 14, the Torah says that he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept upon his neck. Now, Rashi explains that this crying was not just a natural way of expressing deep feelings of 2 brothers sharing the same father and mother, getting together again after so many years. It's that and much more. They were prophetic. They were prescient. Binyamin realized that Joseph will experience in the future a major tragedy, that the temple that will be built in Shiloh, which was the section of Israel that belonged to the tribe of Joseph, will ultimately be destroyed by the Philistines. Joseph, on the other hand, realized that this first and second temples, that will be built in the section of Israel that belongs to the tribe of Benjamin will ultimately be destroyed. See, each one was crying for the destruction of the other's temple. And the Rebbe asks the obvious question, why were they crying over the other one's destruction and not over their own destruction? And the Rebbe answered very powerfully. Now remember, I think I have a recollection that I was there when the Rebbe said this, but certainly it's published in the Rebbe's writings and has been quoted many times by many different rabbis and speakers, but it should be repeated over and over again. He says, when do you cry when someone else's temple is destroyed? Because you can't rebuild it. That's the other person's responsibility. You don't cry when your own temple is being destroyed. The Rebbe says, why are you crying? Build it. Prevent it from being destroyed. Your own temple is not a reason for you to cry about. It's a reason for you to do action to make sure the temple should be rebuilt. There's another Hasidic interpretation as to why they cried about each other's temples. They realized that ultimately the temples would be destroyed because of the division that will exist and has, in retrospect, existed in the Jewish community to the point of sinas chinam, of senseless hatred. As a result, the second temple was destroyed. Many say that the first temple also was a time when it was destroyed that the Jews were not unified. They had other sins as well. When Joseph saw and Benjamin saw the future that will bring about the destruction of their respective temples because of this division, because of this hatred, what they did is to try to prevent it or to introduce the energy that will cause it to be rebuilt. So what do? They each cried not for their own suffering, but for the suffering of their brother, the very antithesis of senseless hatred. Now, they finally come to Israel, but before they come, they've come to Egypt from Israel, from Canaan, but before they come, Jacob sends Yehuda to be a guide to the land of Goshen. And Rashi explains that Yehuda was not just going to be a guide to find a place for them, a scout, where to live. He was going to establish a house of study, a place where the teachings of Torah, the legacy left by Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, would be studied by the Jewish people. And the Talmud says from the days the Jews came to Egypt, there was always a yeshiva, always a place where people studied Torah. Now, of course, you might ask, what Torah? The Torah wasn't given until a few hundred years later. Well, our sages tell us that the knowledge of Torah was known even before the patriarchs. Adam studied Torah, Noah studied Torah. Certainly the patriarchs studied Torah. Whatever form it took then is a separate issue. But Torah, the Jewish knowledge, Jewish values were transmitted, and the yeshiva that was to be established in Egypt, in Goshen, was the function of Yehuda. So the question is asked, why not Joseph? Why couldn't Joseph do it? And the answer is that yes, Joseph was capable of starting a yeshiva. He himself was very much a student of his father Jacob, even more than his other brothers. But Joseph was also a prime minister, a viceroy. He was involved in running the affairs, the mundane financial affairs of Egypt. While he would certainly be qualified to teach Torah and to organize a system of teaching of Torah, because this was not his primary, certainly not his exclusive preoccupation, the Torah would not be transmitted in its full sense. You needed someone who would devote all of his energy, all of his resources for the study of Torah. Another interesting interpretation I just read recently, Jacob was the leader of his sons, of course, and the one who transmitted the values of Abraham and Isaac. As Jacob aged, the greater the person is, and the older they get, the smarter they get, the more spiritual they become, and their message becomes more sophisticated. Joseph left his father when he was 17 years old. So the knowledge that he had was based on Jacob's level of spirituality and of knowledge at the time that Joseph, was 17 years old. Yehuda, on the other hand, when he came to Egypt, he had been exposed to his father's teachings at a much more advanced age, many years later. So he had Jacob's advanced level of knowledge, and that superseded Joseph's level. The lesson for us is we are students and disciples of great Jewish leaders, we in particular of the Rebbe, and the Rebbe, in the decades of his leadership, and he continues to be our leader, but in the decades where we were able to hear his teachings, the Rebbe grew and developed more and more sophisticated levels of Torah knowledge and of the approach to Torah. And there were some people who remember the Rebbe in the first 10 years, and some in the second 10 years, and others in the third or fourth decade. The lesson is that we have to grow with our Rebbe, grow with our teachers, not say, well, I'm content with being like my teacher was in his initial stages. As the teacher grows, so do the students grow. They came to Goshen. Now, in Hebrew, the word to Goshen is written Goshna, and is an interesting and acute hint to Hanukkah, because this Parsha always occurs the Shabbos after Hanukkah. The word Goshna has the 4 letters that are on the dreidel. People think the dreidel is just some kid's toy. No, it has a lot of significance. While we don't know the origin of the custom very definitively, where it started, the tradition is that the little kids, when they were studying Torah against the law of the Syrian Greeks, they would take out their tops to play them when the sentries would come to inspect to see what they were doing, as a way of hiding their Torah study. So it's a symbol of the self-sacrifice of the children at the time of the story of Hanukkah. But there are later authorities who say that the 4 letters of the dreidel represent 4 different exiles. Each letter represents another one of the 4 exiles: Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman. Those are the 4 principal exiles. Each one is hinted in one of those letters. But there's another more powerful message. The 4 letters of Goshna that are on the dreidel, if you add them up numerically, because in Hebrew every letter is also a number, it is the equivalent of 358, which is the numerical value of the word Mashiach. So the dreidel says, yes, there are many different nations that try to subjugate us. There are nations that are gathering and are preparing to gather in Paris in another few weeks to make decisions that will impact the security and the integrity of Israel. And all these nations, these 70 nations, are all represented by the 4 sides of the dreidel, and they spin and they spin and they spin with all of their rhetoric, and the end is they collapse. And Israel remains with its full integrity and will not be compromised at all. That's what the dreidel symbolizes, that ultimately we will outlive all of our enemies, all of the empires that have since disappeared, but Goshna, the Jews, will remain intact with the coming of Mashiach, with the Messianic age. Then Jacob takes all of his children, his grandchildren, entire family, and he brings them to Egypt. How many people were there totally? It says 70. The number 70 is not an accident. There are 70 root nations that are mentioned earlier in Genesis as the descendants of Noah, that became the fathers of the progenitors of 70 different nations, from which many other nations also emerged. And it's interesting that when the media reported about this conference in Paris, they spoke about 70 nations. spoke about 70 nations, and there were 70 root children and grandchildren of Yaakov, of Israel. And it's 70 for 70. The 70 descendants of Jacob are the influence that affects, refines, and counteracts the negativity of the 70 nations. 70 is also the number of the members of the Sanhedrin, the Supreme Court in Israel. There were 71, but the 71st was the leader of the Sanhedrin. Moses gathered 70 sages. So it's the 70 sages that are the inspiration and the power of the 70 root Jewish individuals, the source and root of the 70 nations of the world. So when we gather to study Torah, which is represented by the 70 members of the Sanhedrin, when we are unified, which represents the 70 root Jewish individuals, we can vanquish all the negativity and salvage all the good in the 70 nations of the world. And that, again, reinforces our belief that we do not have to worry about what the nations are saying. Just read the second Psalm, where it talks about how the nations rage and God laughs at them. We also look at the 47th Psalm, which we say every Monday. It also talks about how the nations of the world will not get their way, that we will prevail. Have a good evening and a good Shabbos.